The traffic stop happened at 4:15 on a Friday afternoon in April 2019, just outside Ozark, Alabama. When Vernon Cale pulled his pickup truck onto the shoulder of Highway 231, he looked mildly annoyed, the way anyone does when blue lights flash in the rear-view mirror for what seems like no good reason. A broken taillight, the officer would later say, though that wasn't really why they'd stopped him. Vernon stepped out of the truck. 58 years old, wearing work boots and a faded Alabama Crimson Tide t-shirt. His hands moved to his pockets in that casual way people do when they're not expecting trouble. When Detective Imogen Shaw approached with handcuffs, his face went through a series of changes that she would remember for the rest of her career. Confusion first, his eyebrows pulling together like he couldn't understand why a detective was here for a traffic violation. Then denial, shaking his head slightly as Shaw began reading his Miranda rights. Then fear, real and sudden, draining the color from his face. And finally, something else. Resignation, maybe, or relief, as if he'd been carrying weight for so long that its removal felt almost like mercy. For 26 years, Vernon Cale had walked the same streets as Margaret Pritchett, the mother of the girl he murdered. He'd bought groceries at the same Piggly Wiggly, attended services at First Baptist Church, just 3 blocks from where Delilah's family still kept her bedroom exactly as she'd left it in 1993. He'd coached Little League, waved to neighbors, lived what everyone thought was an ordinary, unremarkable life. Before we go further, I want to know where you're watching this from and what time it is right now. Drop that in the comments, because this story is reaching people all over the world, and these girls deserve to be remembered everywhere. Subscribe to Cold Case Scenes for your daily dose of captivating cold case stories. But to understand how we got here, to this traffic stop, and this arrest, and the end of 26 years of waiting, we need to go back to August 14th, 1993. To a Saturday night in Dale County, Alabama, when 2 girls got lost on back roads and never made it home. The heat hung over Dale County like a wet blanket that August evening, the kind of oppressive Alabama humidity that made the air itself feel alive, clinging to skin and turning every breath into work. It was August 14th, 1993. A Saturday night when the whole world seemed to slow down and stretch out, lazy and infinite. The way summer nights do in small towns where everyone knows everyone, and tragedy always feels like something that happens somewhere else, to someone else. Delilah Marie Pritchett sat behind the wheel of her mother's powder blue 1989 Buick LeSabre, windows rolled down because the air conditioning had quit working in July, and her father kept saying he'd fix it, but hadn't yet. 17 years old, with blonde hair pulled back in a bright pink scrunchie, the kind every girl seemed to wear that summer. She had on cut-off denim shorts and a white tank top with a sunflower printed across the front. Her best friend Autumn Waverly rode passenger side, fiddling with the radio dial, trying to find something decent between the static and the country stations that dominated the airwaves. Autumn was also 17, dark-haired and quick to laugh, wearing paint-stained overalls over a yellow t-shirt, white canvas sneakers covered in stars and peace signs she'd drawn herself with fabric markers during study hall. They'd been inseparable since 7th grade, when Autumn's family moved to Enterprise from Montgomery, and Delilah invited the nervous new girl to sit at her lunch table. That single act of kindness had cemented a friendship that lasted through all the small betrayals and reconciliations that characterize teenage social life. They were the kind of friends who spent every weekend together, who had inside jokes no one else understood, who could communicate with just looks, who finished each other's sentences. Tonight, they were celebrating Delilah's 17th birthday belatedly, because her actual birthday had fallen on a Wednesday, which meant family dinner with her younger brothers and no real celebration at all. So this Saturday was the makeup, the real party, happening at Autumn's cousin's house, about 30 miles north in a town called Elba, where there would be a bonfire and a keg someone's older brother had acquired, and all the freedom that came with being 17 and feeling invincible the way teenagers always do before life teaches them otherwise. They'd left Enterprise around 8:30, planning to arrive by 9, expecting to stay until midnight. Maybe later, if Delilah could convince her mother that curfew could slide just this once. But somewhere between Enterprise and Elba, they'd gotten turned around, taken a wrong exit off Highway 27, and found themselves on unfamiliar back roads that all looked the same in the gathering darkness. Pine trees pressing in from both sides, asphalt cracked and patched, stretching endlessly forward without landmarks or signs, or anything to indicate where they actually were. Autumn had a gas station map spread across her lap, one of those folded paper Alabama road maps. But in the dim glow of the dashboard, she couldn't make sense of the tiny roads, and the turns kept coming too fast. They passed the same abandoned barn twice, realized they were going in circles, started to laugh at first because getting lost was funny when you were 17, and together, and the night was still young. But as the minutes stretched into an hour and the gas gauge crept lower, the laughter took on an edge of nervousness. At approximately 9:50, they pulled into a Texaco station in a small town called Ozark. Neither of them had heard of it before. The station was still open, harsh fluorescent lights revealing a counter with cigarette advertisements and a middle-aged man in a Dale Earnhardt cap working the register. Delilah pulled up to a pump, and Autumn went inside to ask for directions, while Delilah pumped $10 worth of unleaded, the only money she had left from babysitting the neighbor's kids. Autumn came back shaking her head, said the guy's directions didn't make sense. Something about going back the way they came, then taking a left at the old Miller place, which meant nothing to girls who'd never been to Ozark in their lives. There was a payphone outside the station, its metal cord glinting under the lights, and Autumn suggested calling her cousin to get better directions, or maybe just going home and forgetting the whole thing. But Delilah insisted they could figure it out, that they'd come this far, and missing the party would be worse than being late. So they climbed back into the Buick and pulled out of the Texaco, turning right onto a street the attendant said would eventually connect to Highway 231. That was 9:57 on Saturday night, August 14th, 1993, the last confirmed sighting of Delilah Pritchett and Autumn Waverly alive. Two girls in a powder blue Buick, pulling away from a gas station, their headlights cutting through the darkness, disappearing around a corner into a moment that would define them forever. They had no idea that pulling away from that gas station would be the last decision they'd ever make freely. Sunday morning arrived with the same oppressive heat that had marked Saturday, the sun rising over Dale County like an accusation, bright and indifferent to the chaos unfolding below. At 6:15, Margaret Pritchett called the Enterprise Police Department, her voice shaking with the kind of panic that every parent understands instinctively and prays never to experience. Her daughter had not come home the previous night, had not called, had not answered when Margaret tried the cousin's house in Elba. only to discover that Delilah and Autumn had never arrived at all. The party had happened without them, and no one had thought to call and check, because 17-year-olds are always late, always getting distracted, always assuming everything is fine until suddenly, catastrophically, it isn't. By 7:30, Officer Raymond Hightower had taken the missing persons report and was already making calls to surrounding jurisdictions, asking if anyone had seen a powder blue Buick LeSabre with Dale County plates. Margaret provided descriptions of what both girls had been wearing, gave him the cousin's address in Elba and the route they would have taken. Hightower was 52 years old, had worked for Enterprise PD for 27 years, and had 3 daughters of his own, the oldest just 19. Something in his gut told him this wasn't a case of girls sneaking off with boys or sleeping off too much beer at a friend's house. This felt wrong, felt urgent, felt like the beginning of something terrible that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. At 11:43 that Sunday morning, a woman named Dorothy Faye Henderson was driving to visit her sister in Ozark. She took Herring Avenue, a quiet residential street lined with modest ranch houses and old oak trees that provided merciful shade. As she drove past the intersection with Willow Street, she noticed a powder blue car parked on the shoulder, partially concealed by long grass and flowering weeds. The car looked abandoned, had an odd stillness to it that made Dorothy slow down and look closer. She couldn't say exactly why it caught her attention. Maybe the angle it sat at, slightly askew, as if left in haste. Or maybe just the wrongness of an abandoned car in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's vehicles. She considered stopping, but didn't. Told herself it was probably nothing. But when she reached her sister's house 15 minutes later, she mentioned it anyway, and her sister's husband, Frank, suggested they call the police just to be safe. Ozark Police Department received the call at 12:10 and dispatched Officer Lewis Tate to investigate. He arrived at Herring Avenue at 12:24 and immediately recognized this was more than an abandoned vehicle. The powder blue Buick sat at an angle, nose pointed toward the street, rear end in the grass. All 4 windows up, doors closed and locked, no visible damage, no flat tire, no obvious mechanical failure that would explain why someone had left it there. Tate called in the license plate, and the response came back 6 minutes later, registered to Margaret Pritchett in Enterprise, Alabama. Active missing persons report filed that morning for her daughter Delilah, who'd been driving this vehicle when she disappeared. Tate approached the car carefully, though he couldn't have said exactly what he was being careful about. Just a feeling, a sense that something was very wrong. The driver's side window showed fingerprints smudged on the glass. The interior looked relatively normal, a purse on the passenger seat, a road map crumpled on the floor, a cassette tape case on the dashboard. He tried the doors, found them locked, walked around to the back of the vehicle, and that's when he noticed the trunk wasn't quite closed, was sitting slightly ajar, with a gap of maybe half an inch, as if someone had pushed it down, but it hadn't latched properly. He radioed for backup, told dispatch he'd found the missing girl's car on Herring Avenue and needed assistance immediately. Waited 3 minutes that felt like 30 until Sergeant Dale Watkins arrived, and together they approached the trunk. Watkins used a pen to lift the trunk lid, pushing it up slowly. The August heat seemed to intensify in that moment. The smell hit them first, metallic and wrong and sweet in a way that made both officers step back instinctively. Delilah Pritchett and Autumn Waverly lay in the trunk, their bodies positioned awkwardly, compressed into a space not meant for human remains. Both had been shot once in the head, execution style. The kind of precise violence that spoke of intent and control and a coldness that didn't match the chaotic passion of most murders. Their clothing was intact, mostly, though Delilah's tank top was torn at the shoulder, and there were signs that suggested something terrible had happened before they died. Their purses were in the car, their jewelry still on. Nothing appeared stolen, which eliminated robbery as a motive, left only the worst possible explanation, that this had been about power and control and violence for its own sake. Two girls who'd gotten lost on back roads, who'd stopped for directions, who'd made the simple mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, were dead, murdered and abandoned in a car on a quiet residential street in a town they'd never heard of before that Saturday night. If you're finding this case as disturbing as I am, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're going to walk through every step of how this was finally solved 26 years later, and these girls deserve to have their story told. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. These weren't just statistics. These weren't just names in a case file or faces on missing person posters. These were daughters and friends and dreamers who had plans and ambitions and futures that stretched out ahead of them, full of possibility. Delilah Marie Pritchett had been born on August 11th, 1976, in Enterprise, Alabama, the first child of Margaret and Thomas Pritchett, arriving 3 weeks early, as if already eager to engage with the world. She grew up in a modest house on Mockingbird Lane, where children still played kickball, and neighbors borrowed cups of sugar, and everyone knew each other's business in the way that small southern towns operated as extended families. She was a bright child. Teachers said so on every report card. A girl who loved reading and dance, who spent hours in her bedroom listening to cassette tapes and practicing routines she saw on MTV. Her parents enrolled her in dance classes when she was 6, and she took to it with natural grace that suggested real talent, possibly even a future. Her instructor, Miss Patricia, told Margaret that Delilah had potential, that with work and dedication, she might be able to dance professionally, might earn a scholarship to a university with a good program. By the time she reached Enterprise High School, Delilah was captain of the dance team, a straight B student who could have been an A student if she'd spent less time choreographing routines and more time studying. But her priorities were clear, and her parents, who wanted their daughter to be happy more than they wanted her to be perfect, didn't push too hard. She worked part-time at the Enterprise Public Library, shelving books and helping with children's story time on Saturday mornings. A job she loved because it was quiet and left her mind free to think about choreography and music and all the places she wanted to see after graduation. She dreamed of leaving Enterprise, not because she hated it, but because the world was large and full of possibilities, and she wanted to experience them. Wanted to dance on real stages in real cities, wanted to see if she was as good as she thought she might be. Her room was covered with pictures cut from magazines, dancers in mid-leap, Broadway shows, concert tours, all the things that existed beyond the borders of Dale County, Alabama, and seemed both impossibly distant and tantalizingly within reach if she just worked hard enough. Just survived high school and got to the other side where real life waited. Autumn Elizabeth Waverly was quieter than Delilah, more introspective. Where Delilah was all energy and motion, Autumn was stillness and observation. She loved art, spent hours drawing in sketchbooks, that she filled with portraits and landscapes and abstract designs that revealed a sophisticated understanding of composition and form. Her parents encouraged her. Her father, Gerald, worked as an accountant, and her mother, Linda, taught second grade at Enterprise Elementary. Both believed in nurturing their daughter's creativity, even if they secretly hoped she'd choose a more practical career than artist. She talked about graphic design sometimes, about working for advertising agencies or publishing houses, creating book covers and magazine layouts. The kind of work that would let her be artistic while still paying bills. On that August night, she'd been wearing her favorite overalls, the denim ones with paint stains on the knees from an art project earlier that summer. She'd brought her sketchbook, planning to draw the bonfire if it was interesting enough, if the light was right. She'd packed a disposable camera too, wanting to document Delilah's birthday celebration, wanting to have physical proof of their friendship, of this moment in time when they were 17 and the future stretched endlessly ahead, full of promise and potential and all the things they would do together, all the adventures they would have, the lives they would build that seemed so certain, so inevitable, before everything ended on a dark street in a town they'd never heard of. These girls had dreams. They had plans. They had families who loved them and friends who needed them, and futures that should have included college and careers and marriages and children of their own. All of it stolen in one night by someone whose name they never learned, whose face they probably never even saw clearly in the darkness. Detective Marcus Lowell from the Alabama Bureau of Investigation arrived at the scene at 12:58, bringing with him resources that Ozark PD simply didn't have. He was 47 years old with 23 years in law enforcement and a methodical approach that valued procedure over intuition, though he understood both had their place. He walked the scene slowly, making notes in a small, spiral-bound notebook that he always carried, asking questions of the officers who discovered the vehicle, examining the car's exterior for any marks or damage that might provide clues, finding nothing obvious, nothing that suggested a struggle had occurred here. The car had been driven to this location, parked, abandoned with its horrific cargo left to be discovered. Chief Robert Harlan stood at the perimeter, watching his small town transform into something from television. Yellow tape fluttering in the sluggish breeze. Police cruisers and unmarked vehicles and an ambulance waiting at a respectful distance. Neighbors emerging onto porches and lawns, watching with hands shielding their eyes from the merciless sun, asking each other what had happened, who it was, why the police were there. Ozark PD consisted of exactly 14 officers, and none of them had ever worked a double homicide. This was beyond their experience, beyond their training, beyond anything they'd imagined dealing with in a town where the most serious crimes usually involved domestic disputes and drunk drivers. Crime scene technicians photographed everything from multiple angles, documenting the car's position, the open trunk, the surrounding area. Every detail captured on film because in 1993, digital photography was still a novelty, still something most departments couldn't afford. The bodies were examined where they lay. The trunk of a car, not an ideal location for forensic work, but necessary before they could be moved. Dr. Patricia Williams from the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences performed the preliminary examination, noting the single gunshot wounds to each victim's head, the stippling pattern that suggested close range, the lack of defensive wounds on either girl, which indicated they'd been surprised or had been unable to fight back. but it was the condition of Delilah's clothing that told a darker story. Her tank top was torn at the shoulder, her underwear displaced in ways that suggested sexual assault had occurred before, or possibly during, the murders. Dr. Williams collected samples, swabs of biological material that would be sent to the lab for analysis, cataloged everything with the precision that would become critical years later when this evidence would be all that remained, all that could possibly solve what happened on this August night in Ozark. Lowell ordered the car towed to a secure facility where it could be processed thoroughly, every inch examined for fingerprints, hair fibers, any trace evidence that might identify who had been inside, besides the victims. The Buick was transported at 2:40 that afternoon, leaving behind only flattened grass and tire impressions and the psychic weight of what had occurred. Neighbors would say later that the street never felt the same afterward, that even after the police left and life returned to its normal rhythms, there was a shadow over that spot, a sense memory of violence that never quite dissipated. The autopsies were performed Monday morning, both girls transported to Montgomery, their families notified Sunday evening in the kind of conversations that destroy worlds, that create a before and after that can never be bridged. Dr. Williams worked with meticulous care, documenting every injury, every mark, every detail that might later prove significant. The cause of death for both victims was clear: single gunshot wounds to the head, fired from close range with what appeared to be a .38 or 9mm handgun. Though without recovering the bullets, which had passed through and exited the skulls, the exact caliber remained speculative. The ammunition had not been recovered at the scene, suggesting the murders had occurred elsewhere, and the bodies transported to Herring Avenue afterward. But it was the other evidence that would prove most significant. The biological material collected from Delilah during the autopsy, semen found on her underwear and in vaginal swabs, indicated sexual assault, and more importantly, it provided DNA evidence, genetic material from whoever had committed this crime. The technology for DNA analysis had existed since the late 1980s, but was still relatively new in 1993, still expensive and not universally available. But Alabama had established its forensic DNA lab in 1991, and Dr. Williams understood the potential value of this evidence. Understood that even if they couldn't identify a suspect immediately, the DNA could be preserved, stored, maintained in conditions that would keep it viable for years, possibly decades, possibly until technology advanced enough to extract answers from it. The DNA analysis took 3 weeks, samples sent to the state lab in Montgomery, where technicians extracted genetic material from the semen and created a DNA profile using the RFLP method, which was standard at the time. By September 10th, the lab had generated a profile that could theoretically be compared against suspects. The problem, of course, was that they needed suspects to compare it against. And in August of 1993, the FBI's combined DNA index system, known as CODIS, didn't exist yet, wouldn't be operational until 1998, which meant the DNA evidence, while potentially invaluable, was currently just data sitting in a file, waiting for someone to match it against. The car yielded fingerprints, 11 partial prints lifted from the steering wheel, dashboard, and door handles. All but 3 belonged to either Delilah or Autumn. The remaining 3 couldn't be identified, matched no one in the Alabama criminal database, weren't connected to any other crime in the system. They existed in isolation, these fingerprints, evidence of someone who'd been in the car, but whose identity remained frustratingly unknown. Investigators conducted over 300 interviews in the first 2 weeks, speaking with everyone who knew the victims, everyone who'd been at the party, everyone who lived on Herring Avenue, or might have been in Ozark Saturday night. They interviewed Delilah's ex-boyfriend Marcus, who provided a solid alibi and DNA sample willingly, passing both without suspicion. They interviewed male classmates and teachers and neighbors and random men with criminal records who lived within a 50-mile radius of Ozark, collecting DNA samples from 73 individuals by the end of September, comparing each against the evidence from Delilah's autopsy. Finding no matches, finding nothing but dead ends and frustration. The investigation was about to hit a wall that would last over 2 decades. Drop a comment telling me what you think happened, because what comes next is going to shock you. By spring of 1994, the investigation had stalled. Every lead pursued and exhausted. Every witness interviewed multiple times. Every piece of evidence examined and re-examined, yielding nothing that moved the case forward. Detective Lowell maintained a file thick with reports and photographs and lab results, but no suspects, no arrests, no closure for the families who called him weekly, asking for updates that he couldn't provide. The DNA evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology or luck or divine intervention to make it useful. The fingerprints remained unidentified. The murder weapon was never recovered. Whoever had killed Delilah Pritchett and Autumn Waverly had seemingly vanished without leaving any trail that investigators could follow. August 14th, 1994, marked the first anniversary of the murders, and Enterprise held a candlelight vigil in the town square, where more than 200 people gathered on a humid evening so similar to the night the girls disappeared. Margaret Pritchett stood at the center, surrounded by neighbors and church members and parents who clutched their own children a little tighter, understanding how quickly everything could be taken away. Gerald and Linda Waverly stood beside her, all 3 parents holding candles that flickered in the still air, their faces hollowed out by grief, by the particular agony of not knowing why, not having answers, not being able to assign blame or understand what their daughters had done to deserve this fate. People gave speeches about remembering the victims, about not letting their memories fade, about continuing to fight for justice. But the words felt hollow, felt like rituals performed because no one knew what else to do. In the spring of 1995, the Waverlys sold their house in Enterprise and moved to North Carolina. Linda's sister lived there, and they needed distance, needed to escape the constant reminders, the well-meaning neighbors who asked how they were doing, the streets where Autumn had ridden her bike, the high school where her artwork still hung in the hallways. Gerald never recovered from losing his daughter, developed heart problems that doctors said were stress-related, became withdrawn and silent. A man who'd lost not just his child, but his ability to engage with the world. He died in September of 2003, at the age of 56, and Linda would say later that he'd really died in August of 1993, that the decade in between was just his body catching up to what his heart already knew. Margaret Pritchett didn't have the luxury of moving away. Thomas had a job at the local Ford dealership that provided their only income, and his elderly mother lived with them, needed care, couldn't be relocated. So Margaret stayed in Enterprise, in the house on Mockingbird Lane, and kept Delilah's room exactly as it had been on August 14th, 1993. The sunflower bedspread, the posters of dancers, the cassette tapes arranged alphabetically, the dance trophies lined up on shelves. She dusted the room every Sunday morning, opened the window to air it out, closed the door gently as if Delilah might be sleeping and shouldn't be disturbed. Neighbors worried about her, this inability to let go. But grief doesn't operate on schedules, doesn't respect what's healthy or normal. And keeping that room preserved was the only way Margaret knew to maintain connection to the daughter who'd been taken from her. The case was transferred to a new detective in 1996, when Detective Lowell retired after 30 years of service. The new investigator reviewed the file, submitted the DNA to CODIS, which had become operational in 1998, and waited for results that never came. No match, the system would report, and he'd close the file and move on to other cases that felt more solvable, more likely to yield results. He submitted the DNA again in 2000 and 2003 and 2006. Each time the database had grown larger, had more profiles entered by law enforcement agencies across the country. Each time, the result was the same: no match. By the year 2000, the case had been officially designated a cold case, moved to a filing cabinet where other unsolved homicides waited in folders that grew dusty and neglected as years passed and memories faded. Delilah and Autumn had become statistics, entries in a database of unsolved crimes, their names occasionally mentioned by true crime enthusiasts on early internet forums, but mostly forgotten by everyone except their families, who carried the weight of their absence every single day. They became ghosts haunting the streets of Enterprise and Ozark, appearing in the faces of teenage girls who looked similar enough to trigger memories, who laughed in ways that sounded familiar, who drove powder blue cars that made Margaret's chest tighten until she could verify it wasn't, somehow, impossibly, her daughter returned from wherever the dead go. They haunted investigators too, the ones who'd worked the case and failed to solve it, who lay awake some nights thinking about those 3 unidentified fingerprints, about the DNA profile sitting uselessly in a computer, waiting for a match that might never come. And all those years, someone walked free, lived an ordinary life, went to work and came home and slept peacefully in his own bed while 2 families remained broken, while justice remained a theoretical concept that existed somewhere beyond reach, while the calendar pages turned and 1993 became 1995, became 2000, became 2010, and still nothing changed. Still no answers came. Still the case file gathered dust in a cabinet, waiting for a miracle. Detective Imogen Shaw arrived at the Ozark Police Department in January of 2017. A cold case specialist with 12 years of experience working unsolved homicides in Birmingham. She'd built a reputation for persistence, for looking at old evidence with fresh eyes, for refusing to accept that some cases were simply unsolvable. Chief Harlan had retired years earlier, and the new chief, Daniel Mercer, had specifically requested Shaw, hoping she might bring closure to cases that had haunted the department for decades. The Pritchett Waverly murders sat at the top of the stack, waiting for someone with the skill and determination to give them another chance. Shaw spent 3 months doing nothing but reading files, immersing herself in the investigation from 1993, studying crime scene photographs, reviewing witness statements, memorizing timelines, and building mental maps of who had been where and when. She studied the DNA evidence, the fingerprints, the autopsy reports, every piece of data that had been collected and preserved over 24 years. She visited the location on Herring Avenue where the car had been found, stood there imagining what had happened, trying to understand the mind of someone who would commit this kind of violence against 2 strangers who posed no threat, who had simply been lost on back roads. By April of 2018, Shaw knew the case as well as anyone living. possibly better than the original investigators who'd worked it when details were fresh and overwhelming in their immediacy. She knew the victims, their habits, their friendships, their plans for the night they disappeared. She knew the evidence, its strengths and limitations. She knew what had been tried and what avenues remained unexplored. And she understood that without new technology or new witnesses, this case would remain exactly where it had been for 25 years, filed away, unsolved, waiting for something to change. That something arrived on April 24th, 2018, when Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested in California for crimes committed in the 1970s and 80s as the Golden State Killer. The arrest made national news, not because of who DeAngelo was, but because of how he'd been caught, through forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that used DNA uploaded to public genealogy databases to identify suspects through their relatives. Investigators had taken crime scene DNA, created a genetic profile, uploaded it to GED Match, a public database where people searched for distant relatives, built family trees from third and fourth cousins, narrowed down possibilities until they identified DeAngelo, then confirmed his identity with a direct DNA sample. Shaw watched the news coverage with growing excitement, recognizing immediately that this same technique could be applied to her case. The DNA evidence from 1993 was still viable, still available, still waiting to be useful. She spent the next week researching genetic genealogy, contacting experts, learning about the process and its limitations, understanding that this represented possibly the only chance left to solve a case that had defied every traditional investigative method. In August of 2018, with approval from Chief Mercer and funding secured through a grant, Shaw sent the DNA evidence to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The preserved samples from Delilah's autopsy traveled across state lines, carrying with them 25 years of hope and frustration, and the weight of two families still waiting for answers. Parabon extracted DNA, created a complete genetic profile using technology that hadn't existed in 1993. Technology that could read genetic information with precision that earlier methods couldn't approach. In November of 2018, that genetic profile was uploaded to GED Match under protocols that protected privacy while allowing law enforcement access. The database returned matches, distant relatives, people who shared small percentages of DNA with whoever had murdered Delilah Pritchett and Autumn Waverly. Genealogist C.C. Moore, who'd worked on the Golden State Killer case, took on the painstaking work of building family trees, starting with fourth and fifth cousins, working backward through generations, identifying common ancestors, then working forward through all their descendants, creating lists of names and locations and possibilities. The work took months, required access to birth records, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, military records, every piece of documentary evidence that tracks human lives through time. Moore built trees with hundreds of branches, followed lines that dead-ended or led nowhere relevant, eliminated possibilities one by one, narrowing the field through process of elimination and genetic probability. Shaw received updates, monthly reports of progress that felt agonizingly slow, but represented real movement after decades of stagnation. In March of 2019, Moore provided a list of surnames that appeared repeatedly in the family trees. Cale was among them, and when Shaw saw that name, something clicked into place, a recognition that felt almost like memory. She knew of Vernon Cale by sight, a man in his late 50s who attended First Baptist Church in Ozark, who drove trucks for a living, who had a wife and 3 adult children, who lived on Parker Street less than 1 mile from where the Buick had been found on Herring Avenue in August of 1993. Shaw pulled Vernon's information, discovered he'd lived in Ozark his entire life, had been 32 years old in 1993, had no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket in 1989. Nothing that would have brought him to the attention of investigators. Nothing that would have caused his DNA to be collected during the original investigation. He'd been invisible, completely outside the circle of suspicion, living his life while 2 families waited for justice. On March 22nd, Shaw visited Vernon's house, told him she was working cold cases, asked if he'd be willing to provide an elimination DNA sample to help rule out innocent people and narrow their search. Vernon agreed readily, even seemed eager to help. Signed the consent form, provided a cheek swab, said he hoped they caught whoever had done such a terrible thing. Shaw thanked him, drove away with the sample secure in an evidence bag, her hand steady though her heart was racing with possibility. The sample was sent for expedited analysis. Shaw requested priority processing, explaining the circumstances, the age of the case, the families still waiting. April 4th, 2019. The results came back, and Shaw sat in her office staring at the report, reading it 3 times to be certain she understood what it was telling her. Vernon Cale's DNA was a direct match to the DNA recovered from Delilah Pritchett in 1993. Not a relative, not a cousin, not someone who shared genetic markers with the perpetrator, but Vernon himself. The odds of coincidental match were approximately 1 in several trillion, essentially impossible. This was him, the man who'd murdered 2 girls, the man who'd lived 1 mile from where their bodies were found, the man who'd attended church every Sunday for 26 years, the man who'd coached Little League baseball, the man who'd waved to neighbors and bought groceries and lived an apparently normal, unremarkable life while carrying the secret of what he'd done that August night in 1993. Shaw spent the next week building an airtight case, pulling employment records that showed Vernon Cale had worked for Henderson Trucking in August of 1993, a local company based in Ozark that hauled agricultural equipment throughout the Southeast. His work log showed he'd been in town on August 14th, not scheduled for a long haul until Monday the 16th, which meant he'd been available, free to move around Dale County on the night 2 girls disappeared. He'd been 22 years old, unmarried, living with his parents in a house on Camden Road just off Highway 231. The same highway the Texaco attendant had directed Delilah and Autumn toward when they asked for directions back to Enterprise. Investigators searched for any connection between Vernon and the victims, any reason their paths might have crossed before that night. Finding nothing. Delilah and Autumn had never been to Ozark before August 14th, had no friends there, no relatives, no reason to know Vernon Cale or be known by him. This had been a random encounter. 2 girls lost on back roads, crossing paths with someone whose intentions they couldn't have possibly anticipated, couldn't have defended against. The terrible randomness of violence that doesn't discriminate, doesn't require motive beyond opportunity. April 12th, 2019. Shaw coordinated with patrol officers to execute the arrest away from Vernon's home, away from his family. She wanted this done quietly, wanted to avoid the spectacle of neighbors watching, wanted to give Patricia Cale and her children a few hours before their world imploded. At 4:15 that Friday afternoon, Vernon was pulled over on Highway 231 for a broken taillight that may or may not have actually been broken. Shaw arrived moments later with handcuffs and Miranda rights and 26 years of questions that needed answers. Vernon stepped out of his truck wearing work boots and that faded, crimson-tied shirt, looking mildly irritated the way anyone does when interrupted by police for something trivial. When Shaw approached, his expression shifted through emotions so distinct they could have been photographs. Confusion, pulling his eyebrows together as he tried to understand why a detective was here. Denial, shaking his head slightly as Shaw began reading his rights, informing him he was under arrest for the murders of Delilah Pritchett and Autumn Waverly. Fear, draining color from his face, making him look suddenly older, suddenly fragile. And finally, something else. Resignation, maybe. Or relief. As if he'd been carrying weight for 26 years, and its removal felt almost like mercy. As if he'd been waiting for this moment, knowing it would eventually come. Knowing that secrets this terrible don't stay buried forever. Shaw would later tell colleagues that Vernon didn't ask what evidence they had, didn't protest his innocence, didn't demand to see a lawyer. Just stood there with his hands behind his back, accepting the handcuffs, accepting the end of whatever life he'd built on top of the bodies of two girls he'd murdered on a Saturday night in August when he was 22 and they were 17. Vernon Cale was formally charged with 2 counts of capital murder and 1 count of rape. Bond was denied, given the severity of charges and the flight risk represented by someone who'd evaded justice for over 2 decades. The news broke that evening, local stations interrupting regular programming to announce the arrest in a case that many had assumed would never be solved. Newspapers ran front-page stories the next morning with Vernon's booking photo side by side with photographs of Delilah and Autumn, frozen forever at 17. The community reaction was shock, the particular kind of shock that comes from discovering someone you know, someone you've seen at church and the grocery store and little league games is capable of monstrous acts. Vernon had coached his son's baseball team for 3 seasons, had volunteered at church fundraisers, had seemed pleasant, if unremarkable, had been the kind of neighbor you'd wave to without thinking about, had lived among them for 58 years without arousing suspicion, without giving any indication that he was capable of violence, of rape, of murder. Patricia Cale, his wife of 31 years, learned about the arrest from a phone call from her sister, who'd seen it on the news. She'd left work immediately, driven home, packed bags for herself and their 3 children. All adults now, but still her children, still needing protection from what their father had done. They left that night, drove to her brother's house in Georgia, unable to remain in Ozark, unable to process the revelation that the man she'd married, the father of her children, the person she'd shared a bed with for 3 decades, had done these things, had carried this secret, had somehow compartmentalized it enough to function as a husband and father while 2 families grieved. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the Vernon they knew with the evidence. Some insisted there must be a mistake, that DNA could be wrong, that Vernon couldn't possibly have done this because he was ordinary, was boring, was the kind of person you forgot about 5 minutes after seeing him. Others remembered small things, moments that seemed innocuous at the time, but now took on different meanings. The way he'd fallen silent when the case was mentioned at church functions. The way he'd avoided the anniversary vigils. The way his hands had shaken once when someone brought up forensic DNA at a barbecue. Shaw called Margaret Pritchett on April 12th at 6:30 in the evening, 26 years and 8 months after Delilah disappeared. Margaret answered on the 2nd ring. Shaw identified herself, said she had news about the case. And Margaret made a sound that was half sob, half prayer, said, "Thank God, thank you, oh, thank God," over and over until Shaw worried she might collapse. Asked if someone was home with her, if she needed Shaw to come there. Margaret said no, said she was fine, said she just needed a minute, needed to breathe, needed to absorb that after all these years, justice was finally possible. Linda Waverly had died in 2015 at the age of 63, never knowing who had killed her daughter, never having answers to the questions that had consumed her for 22 years. But Autumn's younger sister, Rebecca, who'd been 12 in 1993 and was now 37 with children of her own, received the call from Shaw and wept with relief, with grief, with the complicated emotions that come from learning that the waiting is over, that justice delayed might still arrive. The trial was scheduled for November 2019. Shaw continued building the case, working with prosecutors to ensure every piece of evidence was documented, every chain of custody verified, every witness prepared to testify. The DNA evidence remained the cornerstone, solid and undeniable. 26 years of proper preservation in climate-controlled storage, following protocols that would withstand scrutiny in court. The odds of coincidental match, 1 in several trillion, meant there was no reasonable doubt, no possibility that this was anyone other than Vernon Cale, no avenue for defense attorneys to create uncertainty. Vernon's lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea deal, life in prison without parole in exchange for avoiding trial, but prosecutors refused. Wanting Margaret Pritchett and Rebecca Waverly to have their day in court. Wanting the full story told publicly. Wanting everyone to understand what had happened to 2 girls who'd simply gotten lost on back roads in August of 1993. Vernon would go to prison for life, that much was certain. The only question was whether he'd accept responsibility or force families to endure a trial. This case teaches us several critical lessons about justice and time, and the persistence required to solve crimes that seem impossible. First, that DNA evidence can wait decades. That biological material, properly preserved, remains viable, remains useful, even when technology doesn't yet exist to analyze it fully. The samples collected in 1993 sat in storage for 25 years, waiting for science to catch up. And when it did, those samples were still intact, still readable, still capable of identifying a killer. Second, that technology eventually catches up to crime. That methods which seem like science fiction today, genetic genealogy, using public databases to identify suspects through distant relatives, become standard investigative tools tomorrow. That cold cases aren't necessarily unsolvable, just waiting for the right technique, the right technology, the right investigator to look at them with fresh eyes. Third, that families deserve answers, no matter how long it takes. That Margaret Pritchett, who dusted her daughter's room every Sunday for 26 years, who kept the sunflower bedspread and dance trophies exactly where Delilah left them, deserved to know who had taken her child and why. That Rebecca Waverly, who grew up in the shadow of her sister's murder, who became an adult and had children of her own while still carrying questions about what happened, deserved closure, deserved the ability to finally grieve without the torment of not knowing. And fourth, that monsters hide in plain sight. That Vernon Cale, who attended church and coached baseball and seemed unremarkable to everyone who knew him, carried the capacity for terrible violence. that we can never truly know what exists behind the masks people wear. That ordinary appearance doesn't guarantee ordinary behavior. Margaret Pritchett still keeps Delilah's room exactly as it was, but she says it feels different now. Not like a shrine to unfinished business, but like a memorial to a daughter who's been honored, who's received justice, even if that justice came far too late. She can finally breathe, can finally close her eyes without seeing her daughter's face asking why, without feeling the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on her chest. Justice delayed is still justice. It doesn't erase the pain, doesn't return what was stolen, doesn't give back the 26 years that families spent waiting. But it provides closure, provides validation that what happened mattered, that Delilah and Autumn mattered, that their lives and deaths warranted the resources and time and determination required to identify who killed them. If this case moved you, please share it. These girls deserve to be remembered, deserve to have their story told, deserve more than being reduced to statistics in unsolved crime databases. Hit subscribe so you never miss a case, and drop a comment with your thoughts on genetic genealogy in cold cases, because this technology is changing everything about how we solve crimes that once seemed impossible. Vernon Cale thought he'd gotten away with it. For 26 years, he was right. But DNA doesn't forget, and neither did Detective Shaw.